"Don't you die on my fence?" Cora Bennett said into the white dark, because talking to a man half buried in snow was easier than admitting he might already be gone. He was tangled in the north line where the post road bent toward her upper pasture. One hand hooked through barbed wire, coat stiff with ice, hat gone, lashes filmed white. The wind kept trying to take him apart piece by piece. If her red heifer hadn't broken from the calving shed and bawled once through the storm, Cora would have ridden past within 20 feet of him and never known there had been a man there at all. She dropped from the sled, boots sinking to the knee, and fought her way to him with the rope looped over one shoulder. He was heavy in the helpless way grown men always were, all dead pull and no help. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat. There was a pulse, thin, stubborn, the kind that made demands of decent people. And before I tell you how she got him home, tell me where you're listening from tonight. What town, what kitchen, what little patch of evening light is holding you together after the day you've had. Because stories like this seem to travel better when they know whose hands are busy and whose heart might need them. Cora cut his glove loose from the wire with her pocket knife and caught the smell of blood under all that clean iron cold. Not much, but enough. A crease along the side of his head. A bruise darkening under one eye. He had not merely lost the road. Somebody or something had helped him off it. She glanced once into the blowing white beyond her pasture and saw nothing except her own mare's ears laid flat and the shudder of the fence posts under wind. She should have gone for Mose. She should have left the man wrapped in blankets and come back with help. But there are things grief teaches you once, and then never stops teaching. 3 winters earlier, Ben Bennett had ridden out in weather much like this to fetch a doctor for a hired hand's wife, and every man in Red Pine had told Cora the same thing afterward, that no one could have gone after him in that whiteout, that the storm had made the choice for them. She had lived 3 years with those words like grit under the skin. No one was saying them over this man. She hauled him free, lashed him awkward and tight into the calf sled, and half drove, half dragged him down toward the ranch house while the red heifer trailed behind of her own accord, bawling like a witness. Twice the sled tipped. Once the stranger made a sound low in his throat, as if he had dreamed himself back into pain. Cora put her shoulder into the side rail, got him upright again, and kept moving with the wind needling every inch of her face the scarf did not cover. By the time she shoved through her own kitchen door, she was shaking so hard the latch rattled against the frame. Heat hit her first from the cookstove. Then the loneliness of the room hit her second. 2 mugs on the shelf. 1 chair forever pulled slightly back from the table where Ben used to lean it on 2 legs. Her life had gotten so spare she could hear the empty places in it. Mose Pritchard looked up from near the stove, long and raw-boned and old enough to be all tendon and complaint. Tobacco tin balanced on one knee. His bad leg kept him from doing much in a storm, but his eyes were still sharp. They widened once at the sight of the man on the sled, then narrowed at Cora as if he could see the whole trouble of the thing in a single glance. "Well," he said, slow as a gate in cold weather, "that's either Christian charity or the start of a hard spring. Help me get his boots off before he loses his feet." Between them they stripped the stranger of frozen coat and boots, wrapped him in warmed quilts, and got him onto the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen that had once been meant for lambing emergencies and sick hands. He carried very little for a man riding alone in January. An oilskin satchel strapped under his coat, a wallet gone limp with wet, a silver watch stopped at 3:20. No ring on his finger, though there was a pale line where one had long been. When Cora opened his shirt to make sure the blood at his temple was the only blood on him, she found a thin leather cord at his neck and turned her face politely away without knowing why. He came to for less than a minute while she was forcing willow bark tea between his teeth. His eyes opened dark and unfocused under the fever shine. One hand caught weakly at her wrist. "Shaw," he said like the name hurt him. "If anybody comes, don't give him the satchel." Then his grip loosened, and he was gone again. Cora looked at Mose. Mose looked at the satchel in her hand. Outside, the wind shoved hard against the south wall as if testing the nails. "Know a Shaw?" Mose asked. She did. Everybody within 30 miles of Red Pine knew Gideon Shaw. He owned the spread east of her creek, the Mercantile's debt, 2/3 of the hay meadow along the lower bend, and enough of the town's confidence to wear power like a clean shirt. He had courted respectability the way some men courted women, patiently, expensively, with an eye to possession. Since Ben's death, he had offered to buy the Bennett place 3 times, each time gentler in voice and harder in price. He said it was neighborly concern. Cora said no every time and watched his smile thin by degrees. She set the satchel on the table and unbuckled it. Inside lay folded survey sheets, a narrow ledger wrapped in waxed cloth, and a packet of papers tied with blue string. Her own name stared up from one page in neat clerk's writing. Bennett, Cora E. Property note, seasonal extension, lien contingency. Her stomach went cold in a way the storm had not managed. At dawn, while the world was still white and raw and the yard posts wore caps of snow, Gideon Shaw rode into her yard with 2 men behind him and a politeness that did not reach his eyes. He left his horse blowing steam and stepped onto her porch like he had every right. "Morning, Mrs. Bennett," he said when she opened the door only halfway. His hat brim glittered with frost. "Rough night to have anyone abroad." It was. "One of my men saw tracks turning in here from the North Road. I'm looking for a fellow who stole from me and likely won't live long enough to regret it. Middle height, dark coat, more education than sense." Cora kept one hand on the door edge. Behind her she could hear the kitchen clock and, fainter, the stranger's breathing through the half-open room off the stove. Gideon's gaze moved over her shoulder, weighing walls, windows, chances. "I haven't seen anyone but my own cattle," she said. Gideon studied her long enough for insult to become its own kind of touch. Then he smiled, smooth as lamp oil. "If you do, you send word. Men who carry what isn't theirs tend to bring ruin with them." He tipped his hat, turned, and rode out of her yard, leaving the porch boards creaking under the absence of him. Cora closed the door, slid the bolt, and realized with perfect clarity that she had just lied to the most powerful man in 3 valleys for the sake of a stranger who had arrived half dead on her fence. Nothing in her life was going back to what it had been. For 4 days the storm kept the ranch pinned under white and silence, and the man in the bed hovered in that mean country between dying and deciding not to. Cora fed stock in weather that bit through wool and skin alike, thawed his hands in water gone pink from returning blood, and slept in a chair twice because every time she stretched out in her own room she woke sure she had heard somebody stop breathing. On the 5th morning he opened his eyes clean, looked around once without panic, and said, in a voice gone rough as cedar bark, "If I'm in heaven, it's smaller than I expected." "You're in my ranch room," Cora said, "which is smaller still." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the first sign he had that kind of face. "Then I owe your ranch room an apology." He said his name was Eli Mercer. He tried to sit, failed, and was honest enough to look annoyed by his own weakness instead of pretending otherwise. Up close, without the storm on him, he was not young, though he was younger than Cora had expected in the snow. Maybe 40, maybe a little past. There was a white line near his left temple under the dark hair, and his hands were a contradictory pair. Scarred like a working man's, clean-nailed like a clerk's. Cora gave him broth and withheld the satchel until she knew more. Eli did not press for it at first. He watched her move around the stove, around the table, around the little rituals of a life reduced to its necessary motions, and she could feel him learning the room by what had been left undisturbed. Ben's hat still hung on the peg by the mudroom. A childless house, but not one that had escaped loss. Men who had looked at grief before tended to know its furniture. By the 2nd day of his waking, he asked to pay for the trouble he had caused. By the 3rd, he tried to stand. By the 4th, he made it to the kitchen table and sat there wrapped in one of Ben's old wool jackets, studying the papers from his satchel while steam from his coffee fogged the lower half of the window. Mose mistrusted him on principle. Not loudly. Mose did most things without wasting sound. But he watched Eli the way old dogs watch unfamiliar horses, prepared to be right about trouble. Cora watched something else. She watched the way Eli listened before answering. Watched how he never took the chair Ben used to take, though no one had told him not to. Watched him fold the blanket at the foot of his bed each morning as if disorder were an offense he could not afford. At last she set the ledger and the tide packet on the table between them. "My name is on your papers," she said. Eli exhaled once through his nose. No surprise there, only weariness and a trace of shame. "It would be. What are they?" "The reason Gideon Shaw wanted me in a snowbank instead of a courtroom." He told it plain, which was the first thing that made her believe him. 3 years before, after the rail spur was proposed west of Red Pine, land along the creek and lower meadows had gained value faster than small ranchers could defend. Gideon Shaw had seen it coming early. He bought notes, extended credit, shifted fences where widows or injured men or folks too deep in calving to argue might not notice until the grass no longer belonged to them. Then he used doctored surveys and feed liens to make the theft look like arithmetic. Eli had worked for the firm that prepared those surveys and transfer ledgers. At first he had thought he was moving numbers from one side of a page to the other. Then he saw original plats vanish, signatures appear where no man had signed, acreage corrected into Shaw's favor, always against people least able to fight. He started making copies. Shaw learned of it before Eli reached the district recorder in Dillon. "And now?" Cora asked. "Now I was headed there when somebody kinder than the weather objected." He said it dry, but his hand had gone tight on the coffee mug. She should have taken the packet to the sheriff. She should have sent him on the moment he could ride. Instead she asked, "Why is my place in there?" Eli looked at her then, directly. "Because your husband died owing for hay and seed. Because Shaw carried the note when the bank hesitated. Because grief makes poor company for bookkeeping, and poor company gets charged for the chair." Cora held his gaze until it cost her something. "You wrote it." "I copied the extension and the lien language." He did not soften it. "At the time, it was one file in a stack. I did not know your name yet." Mose let out a sound that might have been disgust or satisfaction at having mistrusted correctly. But Eli didn't defend himself, and there was something unbearable in that. It is easier to hate a man who explains too much. The easy thing would have been to turn him out. The safe thing would have been to hand him over, satchel and all, and maybe gain herself a softer word the next time Gideon Shaw came calling. Instead, Cora sold her good sorrel broodmare to the Albright brothers for less than the mare was worth and used the money for feed, coffee, lamp oil, and the doctor from town to look once at Eli's head before gossip made the road impassable in another way. News traveled even when snow stayed high on the fence lines. By the time Cora went into Red Pine for salt and flour, the mercantile had gone quiet in that deliberate manner small towns cultivate when deciding how much a thing is their business. Mrs. Peavy at the post counter adjusted her spectacles and looked everywhere except directly at Cora's face. The blacksmith's apprentice missed the horseshoe he was setting because he was too busy pretending not to stare. Only Edith Marr, the schoolteacher who kept ink on 2 fingers and always smelled faintly of lavender soap, spoke as if nothing had shifted. "Your mare sold poorly," Edith said softly beside the flour barrels. "Which is to say, I know you didn't sell her because you wanted to." Cora tied off the sack. "Word gets around. In places this small, it wears boots." Edith glanced toward the front window, where Gideon Shaw's reflection passed briefly on the boardwalk outside. "Be careful who hears what you're short of." Cora lifted the flour. "I'm past careful. I'm down to useful." When she returned, she found Eli out behind the barn in the hard blue sunlight, pale as paper and furious at his own body, trying to set a hinge back on the calving shed door while Mose stood nearby offering silence sharp enough to cut leather. Eli had the hammer wrong in his grip for heavy work. Not weak, only more used to exact weight than brute force. And yet the hinge sat truer under his hands than it had in months. "You'll split your head open again," Cora called. "Then at least I'll know where it happened." "Inside," she said. He looked at the shed, at the horse lot, at the patched world of the Bennett Ranch spread white and stubborn under winter light. "You've got a place trying hard to stay standing. So do you." That evening he asked to see her books. Cora nearly laughed at that. There was nothing romantic or even dignified in a ranch ledger after a bad year. Just figures that smelled of fear. But she brought them out, and Eli went through them by lamplight with a concentration so steady it altered the room. Once, twice, 3 times he flipped back to the mercantile charges and the hay invoices, then to her note extension. "He's charging you for 26 bales you never received," Eli said. "You can tell that from a page?" "I can tell because the weights are rounded like town numbers, not ranch numbers. Real hay doesn't behave itself that neatly." She leaned over his shoulder. His hair still held a little damp from the wash basin. There was a nick at the edge of his jaw where he had missed shaving. Something about the ordinary closeness of it hit harder than it should have, and she straightened too quickly. "Can it be proved?" "Maybe. If the man who loaded it likes sleeping more than he likes Gideon Shaw." The days gathered themselves around work the way hard weather always makes them do. Eli mended what he could from a chair when he had to and on his feet when Cora couldn't stop him. He sorted nails by size, trued warped shelves in the tack room, repaired a broken trace buckle with a patience that made Mose stop pretending not to approve. He spoke little unless asked, but when he did it was to the point. The ranch began, in minor ways, to show where another pair of hands had been. One afternoon Cora found him at the north fence, scarf up over his mouth, splicing a snapped wire while the wind worried at both of them. She crouched to hold the staple bucket steady. Eli tested the tension and shook his head. "Too much pull and it'll shear again. Too loose and it won't hold stock." He set the pliers, braced one boot against the post, and drew the wire in careful increments. "A thing can be half broke and still hold, if you set the strain right." She looked up at him. The words had arrived as if they belonged to the fence and not to either of them. Yet there they were between her ribs, finding their own place to stay. By February he could ride. By the first thaw he could have left without shame. Cora knew it. So did he. The trouble was that the leaving had started mattering before either one of them had been foolish enough to name it. He stood by the porch rail one evening watching the snowmelt drip from the eaves, hat in his hands instead of on his head. The yard was all old snow and black mud. Inside, the stew pot rattled its lid in small domestic sounds that seemed larger than they had any right to be. "If I stay," he said, eyes on the yard, "Shaw will come harder. If I go now, I can make Dillon in 4 days and maybe get these filed before he learns which road I took." "You think he doesn't already know?" "I think he knows enough." Eli turned then. "I also think I've brought enough trouble to your door." Cora crossed her arms because she did not know where else to put them. "That choice seems late to make now." A shadow of pain moved through his face, not from the head wound. "Most necessary choices are." He left before dawn 2 days later with the satchel under his coat, one of Moses' extra horses between his knees, and the kind of thank you that knows words are failing and offers them anyway. Cora stood in the yard without a shawl over her hair and watched him ride toward the west ridge where the light was just beginning to silver the snow. He did not look back until he reached the rise. When he did, it was only once. Then he was gone. By noon Gideon Shaw rode in. He did not bother with false concern this time. He handed Cora a folded notice, crisp from the inside pocket of his coat. She read enough to feel the ground shift beneath her boots. Shaw had bought her note outright from the bank. Payment in full by July 1st, including fees, or surrender of the lower pasture and water rights through the east draw. "Neighborly as ever," she said. Gideon's gloves creaked as he settled them tighter. "Business doesn't improve by waiting on sentiment. My husband was buried before the ink dried on half those fees. And still paper remains paper." He leaned slightly in the saddle, voice soft enough to make it cruel. "That drifter choose you, Mrs. Bennett? Or did desperation simply narrow his options?" She looked at him until he had to take the reins up again. "Get off my yard." He smiled without warmth and wheeled away. And here, while the mud was rising and hope had gone mean and tight in her chest, "Let me ask you something worth answering in your own heart tonight. When somebody has already left once, and the world gives you every reason to believe they'll keep leaving, do you harden yourself and call it wisdom, or do you leave some small part of the door unlatched anyway?" Spring on the Bennett place arrived by argument. Snow shrank back in dirty seams. The creek swelled. Calves came wet and shivering into dawns that smelled of mud, blood, and steam from their mother's flanks. Cora worked from first gray light until she could no longer feel where her body ended and her chores began. July 1st, Saturday on the far horizon like a hanging judge. Eli Mercer returned in May. Not at sundown. Not in a storm. Not in any manner designed to help her meet him kindly. He came up the lane at noon under a plain blue sky while Cora was elbow-deep in a calving heifer and temper already near breaking. Mose saw him first from the fence and spat tobacco juice in the dust with the solemnity of a man watching prophecy misbehave. Cora stepped out of the shed with blood to the wrist and hair fallen loose from its pins. Eli reined in 10 feet from her and removed his hat. He looked leaner than before, sun-browned, the scar at his temple paler now. There was a roll of papers tied behind his saddle, a carpenter's tool bag strapped to one side, and a square timber pencil tucked behind his ear as if he had become half a dozen men on the road and kept the useful parts of each. "I came back," he said. "I can see that." He absorbed the chill of it. "I brought certified copies from Dillon. Original plats from the recorder's office. 2 affidavits from men Shaw paid to move boundary stakes. And enough cash to cover what I owe for the horse, the feed, and every day I spent under your roof." Cora wiped one forearm across her face. "That all?" "No," he breathed once. "I came back with a promise. I won't leave this ranch again until your name is safe on every inch of it." The words landed hard because she had spent too many nights inventing smaller ones. She glanced at the gelding he rode, at the tool bag, at the papers, at the stubbornness in his face. "Promises are cheap in men with horses under them," she said. "Then put me to work until this one costs me enough. There are times a woman says yes because she believes. There are times she says yes because saying no would take more energy than the season has left." Cora nodded toward the barn. "Stable your horse. Then wash your hands. The calf's wrong way around and I'm tired of being the only fool in this county." He was in the stall with his coat off inside of 10 minutes. That was how he returned to her life. Not with speeches, not with romance, but with both arms inside trouble up to the elbow and no complaint worth the name. For a few weeks the ranch ran on work so hard and clean there was hardly room left to be angry. Eli rebuilt the collapsed West Corral gate with square joints that shut true the first time in years. He drafted a proper inventory of her herd. He rode fence with Mose and came back with more information than either of them had gone out seeking. Cora learned that his promise was not decorative. It had weight. It woke before daylight and slept after the lamp went out. But the world did not stop because 2 worn people had found themselves useful in the same place. Gideon Shaw filed a formal dispute over her East Draw access using the falsified survey Eli had once copied. The mercantile refused further credit. The man who usually hauled salt from town suddenly had other commitments. Twice Cora found riders paused on the rise above her place, looking down longer than good manners required. Once, near dusk, she found the latch to the lower hay shed shaved almost through, as if someone had tested how quietly disaster might be arranged. She brought the broken latch into the kitchen and set it on the table between herself and Eli. "Tell me true," she said. "How far into his work were you?" Eli looked at the latch, then at her face, and in that gap before he answered she knew the answer would hurt. "Farther than I ought to have been." "How far?" He rested both hands flat on the table, not pleading, not defensive. "The revised line on your East Draw. The lean language on your note. The acreage correction filed after your husband died." His voice stayed level by force, not ease. "My signature is on the clerk's copy that made the theft look proper." Mose swore softly from the stove. Cora felt the room narrow. "All this time," she said, "I knew before I left in winter that my name touched your file. I did not know how much until Dillon." He held her eyes because looking away would have been easier. "I came back because you deserved the truth with the proof. Or because guilt rode harder than the horse." "Yes." No excuse. No trimming. Just that. It made anger harder to feed, which was its own cruelty. She turned away before either of them could see too much in her face. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing the cottonwoods into a restless silver flicker along the creek. The kitchen smelled of coffee gone bitter on the back of the stove. "You should have told me before you crossed my gate." "I know." "Then why didn't you?" He was quiet long enough for the clock to mark for small beats. Because I had finally become useful to you, and I was afraid the truth would cost me the right. That, more than the rest, made her sit down. The highest tension in a life rarely announces itself with thunder. More often it enters wearing plain boots and waits until every weakness in the wall has been identified. 3 nights later, just after moonrise, Mose pounded on Cora's bedroom door with the flat of his hand. Lower shed. She was halfway into her boots before the second knock. Smoke met her in the yard, thick and ugly. Not from hearthwood but from hay catching fast. Flames had already climbed the east side of the lower shed, orange and greedy, licking up the weathered boards. Horses screamed from the adjacent pen. "Bucket line!" Cora shouted, though there were only 3 of them to answer. She tore toward the pen while sparks blew across the yard like malevolent fireflies. The latch had been barred from outside with baling wire. Not accident. Not lightning. Meanness with planning behind it. Eli reached the gate the same instant she did. He slashed the wire with his knife. A roan mare burst through first, eyes white, nearly bowling Mose over. Another horse kicked through the lower rail. Cora ducked, grabbed a lead, felt heat stripe the side of her face. "Ledger room," Eli said. "The papers. The copies from Dylan. The originals he had brought wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in the feed chest by the shed wall." "No," she snapped. "Horses first." He looked once toward the burning door, once toward her, and obeyed. That was how close they were by then. Close enough to choose each other's judgment under fire. They got the last mare clear. Then a sound came from inside the shed that cut straight through the crackle and roar. One calf trapped, bawling itself hoarse. Cora moved toward it. Eli caught her arm. "The roof's going. She'll burn. So will you." She twisted free with fury lending her strength. "Then don't waste time talking. Short moments make short thoughts." Eli pulled his wet bandana over his mouth, seized the hook pole by the wall, and went in through smoke so thick he vanished in 2 steps. Cora heard wood split above him. Heard the calf cry again, smaller now. Heard Mose cursing as he worked the pump handle until water coughed and then came. Eli emerged bent low, one arm around the bawling calf's chest, the other over his own head as part of the roof came down behind him in a burst of sparks. He hit the dirt hard, rolled once, and Cora was there before he stopped moving, dragging calf and man clear together while the shed collapsed in a hot, bright inward roar. He was conscious, barely. His sleeve smoked where fire had kissed through. The side of his neck was reddening fast. But his first word was not about himself. "Papers." Cora looked. The feed chest by the wall had overturned when the roof beam fell. Burning hay lay all around it. She ran, kicked through sparks, wrapped both hands in her skirt hem and hauled the chest free just as a shower of embers blew down hard enough to sting through cloth. The oilskin packet inside was blackened on one edge but whole. When she turned back, Gideon Shaw stood at the far edge of the yard with 2 riders behind him. All 3 lit orange by her burning shed like sinners discovering fire only after the sermon. He had not even had the decency to stay away. "Heard shouting," he called. "Thought a neighbor might lend a hand." Cora held the smoking packet against her chest and saw then what Eli must have seen months earlier. The man's power was not only in paper. It was in his lifelong confidence that he could stand near any ruin and have folks call it coincidence. Mose, wild-eyed and soot-streaked, took one step toward Shaw with the pump handle in his fists. Eli, half kneeling in the dirt and coughing black, put a burned hand out without looking and caught Mose's sleeve before he reached the yard gate. It was a small motion, a saving one. Shaw's gaze fell to the packet in Cora's arms. Something hard moved behind his face. "Whatever you think you've got there," he said, smooth even now. "A fire makes poor witness." Eli got to his feet, swaying only once. "Good thing there are people besides paper." Shaw smiled at him with open dislike. "You overestimate how brave hungry men are." Then he turned his horse and rode back into the dark he had come from, leaving smoke, flame, and a question hanging over the yard that felt larger than the fire itself. When morning came and the town had to choose between power long held and truth newly proven, Who would still be standing with them? By dawn the shed was a black rib cage against the pale sky. Eli's arm and neck were blistered despite Cora's salve, and the district hearing over the Bennett land note sat only hours away in Red Pine. The storm had arrived. Now it wanted a verdict. Cora cleaned Eli's burns in the kitchen after sunrise because there was nowhere else left for tenderness to happen. Mose had ridden into town ahead of them with the least smoke-stained copies and instructions to find Edith Marr and the recorder if the recorder could be found. The ranch house, stripped by bad night and too little sleep, felt honest in its exhaustion. The kettle hissed. Flies worried at the window. Outside, the surviving horses moved carefully around the black shell of the shed, as if even animals knew when a place had been altered past repair. Eli sat at the table with his shirt off one shoulder, so she could reach the burns along his upper arm and neck. Men in pain often grow noisy or proud. He did neither. He only held the chair seat hard enough for the knuckles to show white now and then while she spread the salve with 2 careful fingers. "I'm sorry about the shed," he said. "I can rebuild a shed." "That isn't what I meant." She set the tin down. He still wore the leather cord at his neck. Up close she could see what hung from it now that his shirt collar was open. Not a talisman, not a coin, but a small brass key worn smooth by years of touch. "My wife kept the key to our first rented room on a ribbon by the washstand," he said when he noticed her looking. "When she died, I put it on the cord. Foolish thing to carry." Cora sat back a little. He had never spoken of a wife before. Not once. What was her name? "Anna." He swallowed. "We had a boy too. Samuel. He was 6 when fever took him. Anna followed come winter." He smiled once with no happiness in it. "I was in Omaha checking freight claims when the doctor wired. I got home in time to bury one and watched the other try not to leave. There are griefs so old they stop bleeding where anyone can see, but they remain warm to the touch." Cora knew that kind. She unsnapped the clasp at the back of the leather cord and laid the brass key in his palm. He closed his fingers around it like a man relearning something by shape alone. "I kept Ben's pliers by the door for 2 years after he died," she said. "Not because I needed them there, because if I put them in the tool chest, it felt too much like I was agreeing with what happened." Eli looked at her. "And now?" She crossed the room, took the old fencing pliers from the windowsill where they always sat, and brought them back. The handles were worn smooth. One jaw carried a notch from the night she cut him loose out of her north fence. She set them beside his key. "Now I'm tired of dead things pretending they still decide the furniture." He let out the breath he had been holding. A laugh almost came with it and did not. Instead he said very quietly, "Some things don't heal because they're weak. They heal because something finally stayed." This time the words did not belong to fences or tools or weather. They belonged directly to the raw human place in the room, and Cora, who had spent years surviving by keeping every soft thing under lock, had the strange sensation of a bolt being drawn from the inside. If that found a tender place in you tonight, if you know what it is to hear one true sentence arrive after too much silence, then you know why people stay with stories like this. Leave a like if you want, subscribe if you mean to keep company here, but mostly just sit in this moment a second longer. Some feelings deserve not to be hurried past. Cora reached into the top drawer of the sideboard and took out the only photograph she had of Ben. A cheap studio card, edges frayed, his expression trying and failing to behave itself under the photographer's instructions. She placed it beside the pliers. "He hated having his picture taken," she said. Eli picked it up carefully by the edges. "He looks like a man losing an argument to his wife." "He usually was." She hesitated, then added, "He died in weather because he believed somebody needed him more than the storm could stop him. And you've been angry with him for it." "Yes." Eli nodded like a man told a fact about weather, not sin. "I'd have been angry too. No soothing, no polished wisdom, just room made for the truth. It did more for her than kindness alone could have done." An hour later Gideon Shaw sent word asking Cora to meet him behind the mercantile before the hearing. Mose wanted to burn the note unread. Cora went. Shaw stood in the alley out of the sun, coat brushed, boots clean, looking like a man for whom the world had always arranged itself into advantages. He held an envelope thick enough to matter. "Take the money," he said. "Walk away from the draw, the lower meadow, and whatever tale Mercer has put in your head. You'll keep the house and enough yard for chickens. No public ugliness. No questions asked of him about where his signature sits." Cora understood at once. If she accepted, she could live. Not richly, not well, but safely enough to get old without more fire. The easy path, at last, laid flat before her boots. "How much?" she asked. He named a figure large enough to steady any widow and small enough to be an insult disguised as mercy. She thought of the charred ribs of her shed. Thought of Ben's pliers on the kitchen table beside a brass key from another life. Thought of Eli in the smoke choosing her judgment over his fear. Then she handed the envelope back unopened. "I don't want your money," she said. "I want what's mine." His face changed very slightly. That was all. But sometimes the true crack in a thing is the one only patient eyes can see. When they entered the recorder's office for the hearing, half the town seemed to have found a reason to be there. Small places love justice best when they can witness it from a doorway. Edith Marr stood near the front with ink still smudged on her fingers. The blacksmith leaned in the back wall, cap in hand. The hay hauler Gideon had overcharged Cora through kept his hat low over his eyes. Mose planted himself by the stove in the corner like old judgment come alive. The county recorder, a narrow man named Trumbull who had spent a lifetime trusting paper more than people, adjusted his spectacles and began to review the Bennett note, the Shaw transfer, the disputed survey, and the matter of the East Draw access. Gideon spoke first, smooth and measured, as if facts were only a species of grooming. Eli spoke second, without embellishment. He laid out the copied ledgers, the original plats certified in Dillon, the affidavits. Then, before anyone else could do the cruel work for him, he placed his own signature copy on the desk. "That mark is mine," he said. "I made it while working for Harker Survey and Claims under contract to Mr. Shaw. I signed what I did not examine as closely as I ought to have. My negligence helped him. My testimony now does not erase that." A room full of people listening for a lie heard instead the harder thing. A man declining escape. Gideon seized on it at once. "There. Your own witness admits fault. A guilty clerk trying to save his hide by revising his conscience. But truth, given enough time and enough patient people, has a habit of arriving in layers." Edith Marr stepped forward with a ledger from the school fund committee, of all things, and pointed out that the boundary tax rolls for the Bennett place had been altered on one date, then altered back in another book 2 weeks later, yet only the altered copy had been used to calculate Cora's lien extension. The hay hauler, sweating through his collar, admitted under Trumbull's questions that the loads billed to Bennett had not matched the loads delivered. Shaw's foreman had instructed him to round up. Mose produced the shaved latch from the burned shed and, more important, the bit of baling wire he had found knotted the same way around the yard gate chain as around Shaw's own freight rig. Then the blacksmith, who had been silent for months because silence is cheaper than courage until one day it is not, cleared his throat and said he had reshod one of Shaw's riders after midnight the night of the fire, the horse's legs singed and smelling of smoke. Not one piece broke Gideon Shaw. That was the remarkable part. It was the weight of them together. Too many small truths set one after another until his confidence had nowhere left to stand. Trumbull removed his spectacles, polished them, and replaced them. A bureaucrat's version of ceremony. "The lien contingency on the Bennett note is void," he said. "The survey transfer is under sufficient question to suspend enforcement pending district review. The East Draw remains with the Bennett property under original plat. All collection action is stayed." Gideon started to object. Trumbull lifted one hand, not loud, not angry, simply final. "And I would advise, Mr. Shaw, that you concern yourself less with intimidation and more with securing counsel." The room did not cheer. Red Pine was too restrained for that. But a change moved through it all the same, subtle and irreversible. Folks stopped looking to Gideon for the next expression to wear. He had not been destroyed. He had become, in the space of a few minutes, a man other people were no longer arranging themselves around. Cora could have said more then. Could have named every hunger and humiliation of the last 3 years. Could have publicly pressed Eli's sign negligence as a lever to pry damages from any man in reach. Instead, she took the voided lean paper, folded it once, and said only, "Thank you for returning the line to where it always was." Edith noticed. So did Mose. Eli noticed most of all. Outside, under the noon light, Gideon paused on the boardwalk as if waiting for the town to right itself around him. It did not. The blacksmith went back to his forge. Edith went to unlock the schoolhouse. The hay hauler crossed the street to speak quietly with Trumbull. Gideon stood a moment longer in his expensive coat, then walked to his horse without another word. That should have been the end of the story's heat. It wasn't. Victory does not instantly teach bruised people how to receive happiness. The practical world had to be put back together. The shed had to be rebuilt. Salt still had to be hauled. Kev still needed branding. The Bennett Ranch had been saved on paper, but paper has never pitched hay or repaired a roof beam. So Eli stayed as promised. Not for a week. Not for the last easy ride of a job done. He stayed through branding, through the rebuilding of the lower shed with truer joints and better drainage, through the first hay cutting in the recovered lower meadow. He paid back the horse to Mose in labor before Mose could argue otherwise. He rode into Dillon with Trumbull once more to see the district review filed correctly. He told Cora where he was going every time he left the yard and returned when he said he would, which sounds like a small thing until you know the kind of life where small things are what restore breath. By August, the Bennett place no longer looked like a ranch waiting to be swallowed. It looked like one preparing to remain. As for the town, communities do not apologize the way single people sometimes can. They amend themselves by behavior. Credit resumed at the Mercantile. The Albright brothers sent a fairer offer for a pair of late calves. Mrs. Peavy at the post counter began asking after Cora's health without the stiff guilt that had first put distance in her voice. Even the preacher, who had once told widows to accept providential redirection with suspicious enthusiasm, tipped his hat and admitted the east drawgrass was greener than he had remembered. One evening in early autumn, Cora found Eli at the north fence where it all had begun, resetting the last of the weather-warped posts before cold came again. The light had gone amber over the pasture. Cottonwood leaves flashed their pale undersides in the wind like fish turning in shallow water. "You could have left months ago," she said. Eli leaned on the post driver, studying the line they had rebuilt. "I know. Your promise is met. I know that too." She waited. He had learned by then not to hurry truths that required walking room. He set the driver down. "I meant every word the day I rode back in. But it wasn't the whole of it." His gaze moved over the ranch, the barn roof, the smoke beginning to rise from her chimney. "I kept thinking if I helped enough, worked enough, repaired enough, maybe I'd earn the right to ask for something beyond forgiveness." Cora felt the old instinct to protect herself rise and then, for perhaps the first time in years, fail to command her. "And what is it you think you've earned?" He smiled faintly. "Nothing. That's the trouble. I don't think this kind of thing gets earned." He drew a breath. "I want to stay, Cora. Not because you need a hand. Not because I owe a debt. Because every road I've taken since Anna died has felt like punishment wearing travel clothes. And this is the first place that stopped feeling like that. If there's room here for me in the days as well as the work, I'd like to belong to it." A hawk cut once across the pasture behind him, silent and exact. Cora looked at the line of posts, straight now against the dimming field. Looked at his hands, scarred and burned and competent. Looked at the place beyond his shoulder where winter would come again soon enough, as winter always does. "I don't know how to do easy," she said at last. He nodded. "Neither do I. I still get angry at the dead. So do I. I wake some mornings already tired of trusting you. Then I'll give you that morning and the next one too." Something inside her, not fear, not precisely, shifted its weight and made room. She stepped close enough to take the timber pencil from behind his ear and slip it into his shirt pocket as if marking a man's place in a house could start with something that small. "Then stay through winter," she said. He looked at her the way a man looks when not daring to mistake mercy for invitation and discovering, to his astonishment, that this time it may be both. Only winter? She tilted her head. Best not make promises cheap. He laughed then, low and unguarded, and it changed his whole face. By the first snow, the lower shed stood better than the old one had ever stood. By Christmas, Mose had stopped calling Eli that fellow, and taken to grunting his name in tones that disguised approval poorly. By spring, there were 2 mugs used every morning without one of them sitting untouched on the shelf. Cora did not become a different woman. That was never the point. She remained capable of silence sharp enough to pair bark and tenderness so deliberate it could feel like prayer. Eli remained a man who woke early and checked the latch twice on nights when wind came up. Love, when it arrived for them, did not sweep the old sorrows out like dust. It built around them, beam by beam, until the sorrows no longer had the whole house to themselves. In June, with the grass high in the recovered lower meadow and the creek full but well-behaved, Trumbull rode out from town with the final district order. The Bennett boundaries confirmed under original plat, Shaw's disputed claims denied, costs assessed against his filing. Gideon did not come himself. He sent the paper by proper hands and kept his distance after that. Men like him seldom vanish. They simply discover that the world has stopped bending in advance. Weeks later, on an evening soft with cut hay and the smell of warm horses, Eli stood with Cora on the porch while the sun lowered copper-red behind the ridge. He took her hand without ceremony. She let him. "Seems odd," he said. "How a man can spend years looking for the place he lost and find instead the place that was waiting." Cora leaned her shoulder lightly against his. "That's because roads aren't near as smart as they think." He smiled. In the yard below, Mose complained to a new hand about fence staples while taking evident pleasure in being contradicted. The rebuilt shed threw a longer, steadier shadow than the old one had. From somewhere in the pasture came the contented sound of cattle moving through evening grass. By the next winter, there was a narrow shelf by the kitchen door for Eli's gloves and scarf, as ordinary and miraculous as any vow ever spoken in a church. The brass key to his first rented room hung on a nail above the windowsill. Ben's pliers still sat nearby, no longer as a relic but as a tool among tools. Some nights Cora still woke to old weather in her bones and listened for absence. What she heard instead was another steady breath in the dark and the soft complaint of the house settling around people who meant to keep it. Home, she had learned, was the place that asked you to stay. And with the north fence running straight against the whitening pasture, his coat hanging beside hers in the lamplit doorway, and an easy snow laying silver over the Bennett ranch, the whole place stood quiet and whole enough at last that no one there was lonely. Next time, I'll tell you about the woman who hired a silent horse trader for 1 week and found, nailed beneath his saddle, a warrant with her own family name on it. Until then, keep the lamp low, keep the door kind, and I'll meet you here again.